Começamos. Olá, bom dia a todos, boa tarde, boa noite. Nós somos eu, a Rozely, Vigas, o Rômulo, Ehalt, e em nome da comissão organizadora do Visões da Ásia, gostaria de desejar boas-vindas a todos à 8ª sessão de 2021 do Fórum Permanente Visões da Ásia, 8ª não, desculpem, 9ª. E esse é o encontro mensal promovido pela Rede de Pesquisadores de Visões da Ásia, uma iniciativa brasileira que visa consolidar ainda mais a área de estudos asiáticos no Brasil e na América Latina. A todos que assistem, solicitamos, por gentileza, que não se esqueçam de se inscrever no nosso canal e de deixar o seu like e compartilhar em suas redes sociais. Para quem quiser se manter informado das nossas atividades, bem como obter atualizações de eventos em escala mundial e publicações a respeito da Ásia, sigam nossas páginas no Instagram e no Facebook. Bom, lembramos a todos que quem tem interesse em obter o certificado dessa conferência deve imprescindivelmente realizar a inscrição online para a sua obtenção. Ou vocês podem entrar durante o chat, vai ser disponibilizado o link e vocês fazem as inscrições. Hoje as perguntas poderão ser feitas no chat ou pelo nosso e-mail do Visões. Vocês podem escrevê-las em português ou em inglês, porque as professoras entendem português e qualquer coisa também nós, o Rômulo ou eu, iremos traduzir para as professoras. Nessa sessão, então, teremos a honra, o Rômulo pode dar a sequência, então, agora. Muito obrigada.
Okay, so thank you very much, Rozely. I want to welcome all. I hope that our connection is good enough for the session. I want to welcome everyone to our first session in English, actually, of this forum. We started it exactly a year ago, holding monthly sessions on topics related to Asia. And we are very happy to have today with us Ines Županov and Ângela Xavier. So I want to first introduce both of our speakers today. They will be talking about some of the intellectual proposals of their 2015 book, Catholic Orientalism, published by Oxford University Press. And our session today will be divided in 3 parts. So first we will listen to Ines Županov's paper, then we will proceed with Ângela Xavier's presentation, and in the end we will open the floor for questions and comments. As Rozely said, you may feel free to write your questions in English or in Portuguese, both on our chat, or email us if you feel that your questions don't fit the 200-character limit on YouTube chat. So, introducing our speakers today, Ângela Xavier is a professor at the Institute of Social Sciences of the University of Lisbon. She is the author of a number of very well-known articles, chapters, and studies, such as A Invenção de Goa, this one right here, published in 2008, the collective volume O Governo dos Outros, organized with Ana Cristina Nogueira da Silva, published in 2016, and of course, Catholic Orientalism, written with Ines Županov and published in 2015. More recently, in 2019, she authored with Nuno Senos the short book 1498, which is the 7th volume of the series Portugal, uma retrospectiva. Today, we will listen to her talk entitled Digging into the Goan Villages, Fragments of Early Modern Micropolitics. And our second speaker today will be Ines Županov. Ines Županov is the director of the, pardon my French, Centre d'études des Landes et de l'Asie du Sud, and a research fellow at the French National Center for Scientific Research. She has an extensive production, including numerous articles, chapters, and other works that I'm sure we are all familiar with. Her monographs include the 1999 book Disputed Mission, followed in 2005 by Missionary Tropics, and then 2015 she published Catholic Orientalism with Ângela Xavier, and she also has a long list of co-edited volumes, including more recently the Oxford Handbook of the Jesuits, The Rights Controversies in the Early Modern World with Pierre-Antoine Fabre, and Trade and Finance in Global Missions, co-edited with Hélène Voutin, to which I had the honor to contribute with a very badly written chapter. She also has recently published with Will Friedman the article Rival Mission, Rival Science, Jesuits and Pietists in 17th and 18th century South India, on the journal Comparative Studies in Society and History. Her talk today is entitled Accommodation and Cultural Appropriation, Looking for Poetic Hypertextuality. So as we previously agreed, today we will begin with Ines' talk. So Ines, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for this kind introduction. You just maybe should have said that I am right now in New Delhi and that it's a very late in the evening. So I hope my brain will be performing as it usually does. So yes, talking about Catholic Orientalism, my favorite topic. I only wish that the book were in Portuguese also, but that's another story, Ângela, right? Okay, so Catholic Orientalism. The book and the term we introduced in the title of our 2015 book was a way to mark out what we saw as an important corpus of knowledge that had been forgotten or misused in the mainstream historiography of Orientalism and history of early modern colonial India and early modern Catholic conversion history. Various disciplines are actually important. Various disciplines, we are all historians, Ângela and I, but various disciplines actually do mesh in this work. So I don't know how to do the slide. Next slide. Do I do or I do?
Yeah, you can do, Professor Ines.
Oh, but how? Oh, let's see. That. No, I don't know how to, what to do. I don't have a no handle.
No, we can't. No, now you.
Okay, share screen.
You don't share now. You can share again.
Okay. I'm trying to share. No, not that one. Okay, is this now on? Okay. Okay.
Yeah. We can see now.
Is that okay now?
Yeah.
I did. Okay, I did something. Okay, I wasn't sure how. So it's on my second slide. Okay. So so this is the dust jacket of the of the book. So we wanted to show with this book this enormous what some would call beached whale of archives relating to India and Asia in general, produced by South European Catholics using different languages, least of which was English, and preserved in archival institutions all over the world, but most importantly in Portugal, Italy, Spain, and in the UK. And we wanted to show that this was a rich source for understanding a long genealogy of Orientalist representations and ideologies. And of course, we wanted these archives to help us construct a more balanced historical account of certain places, events, and people. We also wanted, and I think succeeded in a small way, in cutting through and making a breach in the solidified British and post-colonial and nationalist Indian understanding of the cultural and social history of the Portuguese colonial period in India. And in the same way, we wanted to punch a dent in the Portuguese colonial and colonialist self-congratulatory historiography. And finally, we wanted to reread against the grain, as they say, the Catholic missionary accounts and hagiographies, because these accounts were both dismissed and amply poached by the British colonial historiography. I guess for me personally, and Ângela may talk about her own intentions that may have not been identical to mine, it was the British and partly French historiography that rubbed me the wrong way. As a graduate student in Indian history, I was fed mostly British sources and publications and conceptualizations of the history of the subcontinent. And in fact, all those who studied Indian history before and after the independence were fed British sources and British narratives, because the British managed to hammer in the fact that Indians, especially Hindus, did not write and did not think historically. And the book of James Mill provided periodization that was accepted by all post-colonial, even post-colonial Indian historians, both Marxist and nationalist. Okay, third slide. James Mills, who never stepped on Indian soil, divided Indian history along the religious lines. In fact, he was not just historian. He was a creator of religious divisions. Thus, there was, according to him, a Hindu antiquity, Muslim medieval age, and British modernity, which actually tacitly included Protestantism. So this kind of religious division has a long-term effect, or had, and still has a long-term effect on the way Indians in general perceive their own history. And it feeds directly today into the rabid Hindutva ideology and the regime in power. So Hindutva dangerous hotheads see themselves as cleaning India from Muslim and Christian presence and going back into this imagined Hindu antiquity and the Golden Age. Now, in Mill's historical scheme, the presence of the Portuguese colonial administration of Goa and other settlements and the Christian missions were thus all delegated to medieval history. Let's see. Okay. In fact, Teutonio de Souza, who we regret, who we have lost, recently published his medieval Goa socioeconomic history in 1979, and took for granted that classifying Goa as Portuguese colonial history as medieval was unproblematic. Interestingly, Mughal history as well is still called medieval, Indian medieval history. This is just between, just an addition to what I said before. So with Catholic Orientalism, we wanted to put to rest this kind of perception and classification, since Orientalism, as Edward Said famously framed it, and we were certainly inspired by his work, despite some pertinent criticism that followed the publication of his book. After his timely epistemological intervention, we now all know that empire, knowledge, and modernity were inextricably entrapped. And we wanted to put the question of Portuguese colonial knowledge on the same analytical table. And this is why we disregarded the category of medieval. Since in my work I focused on the missionary accounts, Jesuits in particular, the same problem of periodization between medieval and early modern was also occasionally mixed into the debate. It was clear that British historians located Catholicism in India to the medieval category, while Protestantism was already rational and was about true religion and the harbinger of some kind of progress. Orientalism is for us, therefore, a term that combines knowledge-making and colonial imperial power, and in that sense, we use this term to name practices and certain epistemic strategies that correspond to what only in the 19th century will be called Orientalism. So yes, we are committing a strategic anachronism in terms of naming in order to show the hidden origins of this bundle of processes that created Orientalist handles for dealing with India and most of the colonial world. In fact, Protestant missionaries and the so-called evangelicals who actively supported British imperial project became the worldwide Orientalists, famous Orientalists like the Baptist, William Carey and William Ward, who translated Bible into dozens of Indian languages. William Jones and other employees of the East India Company learned Persian and Sanskrit and formed the Bengali School of Orientalism. And in the 19th century, a Madras School of Orientalism existed. and was recently studied very nicely by scholars around Thomas Troutman, or scholars that he invited to contribute to the book that you can see. And interestingly, the authors of the articles did not specifically comment on the fact that most of the archives collected by Colin Mackenzie in South India were coming from the Catholic missionaries from the Madurai mission and Carnatic missions. Among other reasons we evoked in the book, Portuguese imperial colonial knowledge-making in India was seen as inadequate epistemologically because tainted with Catholic mystifications. Interestingly, Indian knowledge-making was seen in the same way by the rational Protestant Orientalists. That was a challenge for us to show that post-Tridentine Catholicism and Portuguese colonial enterprise were knowledge-making institutions, and that their archive, scattered as they were for other reasons, were often used as primary sources for the more enlightened and scientific knowledge that was produced in England, Germany, and France in the 18th century in particular, and was fed into the Enlightenment movements. Now, France, in fact, contributed to the Catholic Orientalism by way of the Jesuit and Capuchin missionaries and priests of the Mission Étrangère de Paris, who were sent to Persia, India, Siam, Vietnam, China, from the end of the 17th century onward, in direct opposition to the Portuguese Padroado. So French Jesuits inherited, in fact, the archives, not all, but some archives, and this was this is really less known and often forgotten. They inherited the archives from the Portuguese Jesuit missions in Madurai, for example. This is the map created by Jean-Venant Boucher, 17th century Jesuit missionary in Madurai, in Carnatic mission also, which was reproduced and printed in Europe throughout the 18th century. This is only one of its avatars in various languages, in German, in Italian. And French Jesuits were excellent cartographers, but they also inherited a century and a half of archives containing documents of Portuguese missionaries from the Madurai mission, among which were also geographical sketches and kind of proto-maps. But it was Jean-Baptiste Danville's map that became really famous, and you can see it here, and it can be easily downloaded from Gallica, from BNF Gallica, a very excellent collection. Now, the transmission of archives and written text has been now relatively well studied. Relatively, I say, but still studied, and is being studied as we speak. For example, more than 3 decades ago, Sylvia Muir showed how a text written by a French Jesuit concerning customs and manners of the Hindus underwent a series of pilfering by other colonial agents and was finally used by Mission Étrangère de Paris missionary Abbé Dubois, whose picture you can see there from 1820. Who sold it to the British in the early 19th century, sold it and took the money. More than anything, and it was translated into English and widely read, and was incredibly important for the development of ethnography and anthropology of South India. Now, more than anything, missionary intellectual approach, especially those of the Jesuits, who were the outliers, was the strategy of accommodation, which is at the same time cultural appropriation, as we would call it today. It comes in it's the same package. Now, both accommodation, and it goes in 2 ways, but okay, let's start from the beginning. Both accommodation and cultural appropriation are analytical terms that were not used by the Jesuits in the 16th and 17th century. The verb accomodarse was used, but there was another way of expressing the practice and its desired effects, and it was first enshrined in the Ignatian formula, entrar con el otro y salir consigo, or entrar con la de los y salir con la nuestra. Or another one, which is basically omnia omnibus facti, to make oneself everything to everything. These were formulas used when by the missionaries themselves. These are not some kind of passive or theoretical proposals. These were really proposals to do the accommodation, as we would call it today. Loyola's secretary, Geronimo Nadal, added an invisible figure of a door without actually using the word, entrar con la de los y salir con la nuestra. However, in the correspondence and in the early histories, for example, by Fernão Guerreiro and Sebastião Gonçalves, the Jesuits elaborated further this image of penetration as opening the door to conversion. So Roberto Nobili used the Latin expression ostium aperire to define his missionary goal, opening the door. And today we see on every Jesuit website, you can see this precept translated like, and enter through the door, but be sure to leave through your door. Enter through their door, but be sure to leave through your door. That is something that is a precept given to the Jesuit, because he can also get lost while entering through the door of the other. So what this is at first sight laconic invective, saying it can be interpreted also in many ways and can be judged a positive, active interest in another culture and a negative, let's say, intention to change it or to make it resemble one's own. So it can be hegemonic, but it can be also liberating. Accommodation, as this Jesuit strategy came to be known and decried as not better than dissimulation. It goes somehow together. The critiques would call it that way, has been studied in detail in Asian missions, especially because it culminated in the Malabar and Chinese rights controversy, which dragged on for a century before being condemned but not completely overwritten. In Catholic Orientalism, there is a chapter which opens a discussion on accommodation because accommodation requires a particular kind of knowledge. This is one of the chapters that I was basically involved with. It is the linguistic, literary, and poetical knowledge. And some call it actually rhetorical accommodation. However, the rights quarrel revolved a lot also around the issue of Jesuit dress, simply because the Jesuits renounced a strict religious dress code, unlike other medieval religious orders, and the choice of visual appearance is difficult to hide and difficult to argue against convincingly. Sartorial accommodation was flexible, and most of the missionaries devised strategies. You can see a Jesuit, Guy Tachard, dressed in a full, on the first picture, dressed in a full missionary priestly attire at the court of the Siam king Narai. Then you can, in the middle is Nicolas Trigot, who is dressed in the Mandarin silk attire. And on the right is maybe a little bit fantasist representation of Ephraim de Nevers, the Capuchin friar in Madras, depicted or painted by, found in the Niccolo Manucci's manuscript. And he's dressed in a very interesting dress. Nobody understands what it is. And from what we know, Ephraim de Nevers, who has an interesting history and ended up in Goa at the Goan Inquisition, he tried to accommodate Catholicism to Anglicism. So everybody's into accommodation, even when they are against accommodation to Hinduism. Next one is, this is a famous José Vaz, now a saint, a Goan Brahmin and Oratorian missionary dressed as a Portuguese Oratorian at the court of Kandy. But elsewhere, Oratorian priests in Sri Lanka were also, I don't have any pictures, they were also dressed as coolies. It depended where they were dressed according to what was the most strategic dress. So coolies among the Dutch and in the lowlands, and Portuguese priests in the kingdom in front of the king of Kandy. Okay, and then of course, and this is very similar situation in the situation, as you can maybe understand immediately the pattern, the situation of dressing at the court, being a Jesuit at some local Indian or Oriental court, demands the dress of a kind of a dress of Portuguese or some or religious specialist from Europe. It is actually that what the kings wanted to see. So at the Mughal court, the Jesuits always held the position of Portuguese informal ambassadors. And thus they were always dressed in this uniform manner. Just like Oratorians, they were dressed in black. But of course, Mughal painters interpreted the dress in very different ways. So you can see one, this is a famous Ibadat Khane, the discussion moment, the discussion, let's say, discussions that Akbar was having with various religious specialists in the from 70s to 30s, 1570s to 1530s, where two Jesuit missionaries, Montserrat, Anthony de Montserrat and Rodolfo Acquaviva also assisted. And then you have these later paintings, probably, in which it is very difficult to see who is who, but this is how the Mughal painters finally imagined, even if they didn't see them, imagined the Jesuits to look like. So some have hats, some have this other kind of hat, some have this typical Farangi or Portuguese hats, but some doesn't. Very often they have no shoes, but actually they did have shoes, and so on and so on. But this is about the dress. But it was really linguistic and rhetorical accommodation that added heat to the or fire to the rights controversy. Most notably, the manner of translating scriptures and key theological terms into languages of the converts. Now, the language is the door. So here we come again to this door that is very often evoked in Jesuit writing. It is a door to personhood, and was what the missionaries, especially intellectual orders such as Jesuits, aimed at conquering. They were always going over some thresholds into something. They saw themselves as crossing over. They were always crossing over to the place where the other was standing. So this is well known that the Portuguese initially had the dream of making Portuguese the language of command and religion. And here I'm referring to the statement of João de Barros in his Grammatica that he hopes to see soon Gentiles speaking Portuguese, a beautiful language, better than almost as good as Latin, in their temples with the help of his grammar. It is also well known that in Asia, the reverse was the case, not in Brazil, but in Asia, it was the reverse was the case. It was the Jesuits and other orders and other missionaries who had to organize schools and scholars to learn for themselves, to learn the vernaculars and literary languages, and then started translating catechisms, life of saints, a life of Jesus, and similar pious texts into local languages, but first learning and then translating. In addition to, of course, they produced some of the first grammars of the vernacular, Indian vernacular languages. Now, Jesuit Tamil language that I studied in particular, Tamil language learning started on the Fishery Coast in the 16th century. You can see it, the Fishery Coast, in the lower circle. I encircled the Fishery Coast, Costa da Pescaria, because of the, they're fishing fish, but they're also fishing pearls. That's why it is called like that. And Madurai mission in the 17th century. And by the 18th century, the Jesuit missionaries produced a fully fledged writer in the Tamil sense of the word writer, which is the poet or pulavar. And Giuseppe Beschi became a pulavar, or the poet, a court poet, whose verses were read and cited and are still read and cited, although I don't know who can understand them. But my PhD student and now a fully fledged scholar, Margherita Trento, wrote a PhD on it, and it is going to come out as a book with Brill, in which she analyzed the way in which Beschi's Tamil epic, Tembavani, you can see you can see one of the, manuscripts actually, manuscripts, early manuscripts of Tembavani on the picture, on the slide, which is actually a life of Saint Joseph. She analyzed the way Beschi seized every opportunity of the Tamil language poetics to transcreate a Christian message. In addition, he wrote Tamil grammars, a couple of Tamil grammars, one of common language, one of the poetic language. And Beschi was certainly, everybody knows now, and everybody, even Tamil scholars, accept that characterization. He was a linguistic genius. But he was, I don't deny that, but he was also beneficiary of almost 200 years of Jesuit Tamil learning, which included grammars, catechisms, flos sanctorum, numerous other treatises and dictionaries. So Giuseppe Beschi's philological, grammatical, and poetical work had also been appropriated by Protestant missionaries in Tranquebar from 1700 onwards. Protestant missionaries are active in Tranquebar, also on the Carnatic Coromandel coast, and later on by the British Madras School of Orientalism. But it was also appropriated by Tamil literati as well. And even today, some claim that Beschi's Tembavani cannot be work of some poor and misguided European padre, but it is a work of a real pulavar, and his Tamil name, Virama Munivar, is cited as some other Tamil poet, not European. Okay, the reason I think it is possible to talk about poetic hypertextuality that I put in my title in case of Beschi is because he worked up his text partially, that is to say in fragments. These are a series of fragments uniting two texts, in fact. One is Gerusalemme Liberata by Torquato Tasso, and he also mixed in different Tamil poetical works. So Margherita Trento showed how the Council of Demons in Gerusalemme Liberata is transcreated in Tamil. For example, the king of demons, Pluto, with bloodshot eyes and spewing fire, gets layers after layer of local attributes, of wearing dreadlocks like Shiva, and having an elephant trunk like Ganesha or Ganapati, and his fangs were like crescent moons, and his beard was messy and intricate as a coconut fibers, and he brandished a trident with the power to shake the 8 directions. Another Jesuit, the Englishman Thomas Stevens, wrote his Christa Purana, or Discurso sobre a vinda de Jesus Cristo, in the poetic meter, Ovi poetic meter in Marathi in 1614. And he used similar hypertextual poetics in ensnaring the story in the vocabulary and poetic images of the locality. In this case, in the forests of Salsette Island in Goa, that Ângela knows so well. Now, Stevens's poem was hugely popular and inspired emotional additions to the poem, such as Passion, Lamentations. And recently, Ananya Chakravarti studied these in much more detail. And in a way, this was accommodation, but also appropriation of local bhakti registers of devotionality. It was like rerouting the river of popular emotional devotion into the Catholic paddock. Okay, and here we come to Nobili finally. Thomas Stevens was actually an advisor and predecessor to Roberto Nobili. In many ways, Nobili learned from him, and they met in Goa. And Nobili is another important Jesuit transcreator who is often seen as Indian Matteo Ricci, and at the source, one of the sources, one of the instigators of the triggering the Malabar Rites controversy. Just like Stevens, Nobili's first target were Brahmins, but the genre of literature he chose was highly Sanskritized prose with theological arguments preferred over any kind of devotional or bhakti emotions. And so this artificial language, a kind of Christian Manipravalam, combination of Sanskrit and Tamil, had no immediate followers. But the former terminology he introduced was mostly incorporated into Christian language of both Catholic and Protestant missions in Tamil country. Each language and its speakers, targets of translation and conversion, repurposed and twisted the message. The accommodation is thus a turning point where the alchemy, enchantment, or transubstantiation takes place, and results can appear odd. My last slide. So, concluding words. Here is just a small example of how Jesuits strategized translation of sacraments. The first translation of the sacrament of baptism by Enrique Enriquez, a missionary on the Fishery Coast in the early 16th century, was Vavutissimo, as you can see, coming from bautismo, yeah? And this is simply phonetic recording of the Latin word. Now Nobili went further and described it in Tamil and made it sound like intellectual act. Jnana snanam, which actually means ablution in knowledge, or the bath in knowledge. And now Geronimo Xavier, who was the missionary at the Mughal court, used the word imada. I've been reading his works because I am working on Persian, Jesuit Persian mission. So this was a very strange word that I encountered, and the word imada in Persian means a pillar. So I first thought that the Xavier wanted to introduce an image of a pillar of faith. Imadadin is one of the epithet of pillar of faith. Imadadin is one of the epithet of Quran. But then he also used imada ab, which is to say baptismal water. So that doesn't work with pillar. And so it became clear to me that he was taking this word from somewhere else. And then I found out where. Actually, before coming to the Mughal court, Xavier spent 2 years working in Kerala among the St. Thomas Christians who use Syriac Bible, Aramaic Syriac Bible, Old Syriac Bible. Actually, they use a Peshitta Bible, which was an Old Syriac, and in Peshitta Bible, it means this is the word for baptism. So I'm not going to go into further complications of this word, but we know from other languages that Jesuits toyed and tossed concepts, and that some were successful and some disappeared, like Tambiran for God in Tamil, which was replaced by Sarveshwaran. So Jesuits constantly move these, update these terms. So finally, accommodation fabricated universals out of chosen particulars. And Catholic Orientalism we conceived it as an epistemic umbrella under which the transformation was taking place. But the result was always undecided in advance, and the political circumstances actually were important and made the whole thing much more complicated. That is all I would right now propose for today as an introduction to the Catholic Orientalism that was written many years ago already. And my research, as I said, went in different directions, went more to the north, so and into the Persian sources. But Catholic Orientalism remains, has not yet been, I am not yet ashamed of, or would not dispute some of the major points that we made in the book. That's all.
Thank you so much, Ines. I'm sure that everyone is now thinking how to properly form their questions and how to submit their questions. And you all can submit them through the chat or either the email. Feel free to send them while we are all talking here. But for now, our next speaker will be Ângela Xavier. Her presentation, if I may read the title here, is entitled Digging into the Goan Villages, Fragments of Early Modern Micropolitics. So, Ângela, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rômulo, and thank you so much for inviting me together with Ines to these seminaries. And thank you, Ines, for doing such a good introduction to Catholic Orientalism. So I don't have to add much more from my perspective and how we ended up together. But I would just like to say 2 or 3 things that then have also to do what I'm going to say today. Besides all the contexts and the historiographical, bibliographical context that Ines was already referring, and our idea of putting together or gathering knowledge that has been produced between the 16th and 18th centuries and that could fit into the Orientalist target. One of the books that while I was doing my PhD really challenged me was Bernard Cohn, Colonialism and Its Forms of Knowledge. And in that book, on one hand, it had things that were considered modern, strategies that were modern, but somehow that could be found also in the way how the Portuguese were trying to collect knowledge about local societies during the early modern period, that is to say 2 centuries before. The other thing that was challenging for me was that the conclusions of British and French Orientalism provided during the 19th and 20th century were many times challenged by the historical sources produced in the context of the Portuguese Empire, namely in the 16th century. Obviously, in the beginning, I was thinking that I was really stupid and I was unable to match my sources with the big people that were theorizing from England and from France and elsewhere, the places that we sometimes associate with the big theories. well, that we usually associate to the big theories. Then in the process, I started to think maybe they were not so right about this. Maybe actually, if we historicize their own Orientalism, as Ines was already referring to, maybe we come to the conclusion that they were not right for many things. Then it happened when we had this happy meeting, Ines and myself, once before in a conference, but then she was refereeing my PhD thesis. And then it happened that the two of us, we became friends and colleagues and realized that many of our intuitions converged, and that happened in that conversion. That conversion somehow was what allowed Catholic Orientalism to happen. And the book, as you can see, or who knows the book, has many different topics, and one of them, that's the one that I would like to develop today, because it's the one that also inspired one of the lines of research I'm following now, is the second chapter, which deals mainly with the ways of collecting knowledge in the villages of Goa. It's mainly about the interactions between Portuguese officials, Portuguese imperial officials, and the elites of the village, the Goan villages. It's around 130 villages. And and these Portuguese officials at that period were interested in collecting all the knowledge possible about the properties, either land or mobile properties that belonged to the office, to the officials of temples, and to the temples themselves, or the deities that were preserved in their temples. And these, the inquiries of mid-16th century are so rich, and allow us to make a kind of ethnography of these villages, that I got really fascinated with them. It was something that I had already worked, but in a kind of vol-de-oiseau perspective in my PhD. And then with Ines, we did a deeper, we started to dig into the village life. And one of my lines of research now are precisely following these, is following this avenue of research that somehow is contained particularly in this chapter, second chapter, called Documents of Empire. So what am I doing? What am I trying to do now? Oh, it's something that I try to call it, for convenience, imperial micropolitics. It's an expression that I've created. I don't know if someone else has used it already. I have to check it, but it happened to my mind. Let's put it in that way. Coming from Michel Foucault's idea of microphysics of power, in the sense that power is, Foucault's idea was that power is everywhere. It's not only concentrated in the state or in the crown. If we think about early modern period, the Portuguese historiography hardly speaks of state in that period, because the logics and political culture is quite different. But so the idea that power can be everywhere, can be dispersed, and can be exercised in different ways. So my idea is using, a large archive of documents that really exist for 16th century territories of Goa, is to precisely to try to make a kind of anatomy of the power routines at the level of the village, at the villages, and I will ask Guido and Gustavo, I'm sorry, Gustavo or Rozely to put the first map. Yes, so I'm interested in precisely in this territory of Goa that we usually call the Old Conquests. It is a territory that was conquered, part of it in 1510, the part in the middle, and the rest of it was annexed around 1543. And this is what we usually call Goa when we think about this early modern period. Even if in common sense, for sure, but also in some scholarship, there is sometimes the idea of merging the town of Goa, that is that little spot in red, with all the territory. And the territory, well, in the next map, you can see that this, no, not the next map, but the next, sorry, can you, yes, not the next, the map on the side, you can see that this territory was highly fragmented. It was composed by more or less 130 villages. Well, what this can tell us about, on one hand, the workings of the Portuguese Empire, on the other, of the workings of politics and village elites in the context of the Portuguese Empire, and also how can this challenge about some ideas that have been produced precisely in the context of British Orientalism in what relates to, in particular, Indian villages. These questions, I think, that can be, well, addressed. I don't know if they all can be answered properly, but they can be addressed if we take seriously what I call the village archive of Goa, or of the Goan villages. And what is this archive about, and how is it constituted? Well, this archive is, as I've said, it's a large archive, and it's constituted, in my view, by 5 types of documents. A huge type of documents is the one that is mainly used to study these villages or these spaces, and is constituted by narratives by travelers. Well, the huge documentation produced by missionaries, both correspondence or chronicles, official chronicles like the book of João de Barros, Asia, and the successive Asias written after him. Well, we have really a lot of this kind of narrative sources concerning these villages. Well, not all villages, but some of these villages appear in many of these narratives. Then we have another source, a very early source, which is the Fórum de Mexia. Is an administrative document produced in 1526, which already resulted from inquiries made to, well, not all villages, because at that period, actually just the central territories of Goa had been part of the Portuguese Empire. And some of the elites of these villages had been heard in order to make this document that was, well, in first place, a document to synthesize the tributes that these villages had to pay to the Portuguese kingdom, but at the same time was also a useful document to promote the interaction between the Portuguese crown and these villages. It is important to say that this document had been produced before these villages had been Christianized. And before the villages had been Christianized, the Portuguese law considered that the local law, that is to say, the law that operated in these villages, was dominant and should persist in the operation of these villages. That scenario changed dramatically since 1540s onwards. And the other set of documents that I'm going to work with, and have been used already, part of them in chapter 2 of Catholic Orientalism. Rozely, maybe we can take now the map. When this the second one, I ask you, please. Now it's just we can now just put apart the maps, and then I ask you to put the second one. Is that possible? Okay, so let it like this. No problem.
No, I can't.
Oh, okay.
Only these two images only. These.
Okay, that's okay. No problem.
Okay.
So the second part of the documents that I'm working with now, one set of them has been the base of the second chapter of Catholic Orientalism, which are the inventories of the lands and the mobile properties that have been precisely I've referred before, that belonged to the temples and officials of the temples of all these villages, 130 villages. These inventories happen after 1540s, after 1543, and after the moment when the temples of these 130 villages, and it's important to say that some of them had around 10 temples or more, had been fully destroyed, or at least that's what the documentation of the period tells us. So after that moment of destruction, the Portuguese wanted to know which was the goods that belonged to those temples, to transfer those goods precisely to the missionaries. Jesuits were the main winners, let's put it in that way, of this transfer of property, but also Franciscans and other religious orders were. Well, besides this pragmatic goal, the truth is that these inventories allow us already to make other maps. Well, this one that you have now in the screen is a very sketchy map, but a map that tells us that elites of these villages, and I'm going to make a paragraph now about who were these elites, but the elites of these villages belonged to different castes. Belonged to different castes. As we can see, well, there were what the Portuguese called castes, main three castes: the Brahmins, the Shardos. It's a name that doesn't appear in the classical Indian treatises when they are referring the Varnas, and Sudras. And we can see in this sketchy map that this small territory of Goa with its 130 villages were controlled, or these villages were controlled by elites that belonged to different castes. And this already questions the Brahmanical view that for many years and centuries, I must say, prevailed about the territory of Goa itself. So we have this Portuguese source that allows us to reconstruct this power map, and we did to question, just by doing this, because these inventories of lands have also the names of the local elites, which were called the Gaunkas. Gaunkas mean precisely Gaun is village and Kar is the lord or the founder of the village. So they were of the descent, at least in theory, of the founders of the village. They were all male, of course, and they were organized in an association called Gaunkari, which more or less administrated the villages, controlled the ritual life, the ritual and religious life, and also represented externally the village. This can sound a bit strange because we are talking about villages, but each village had a kind of political system inside, operating in a quite structured way. But the people that were in the Gaunkari, as we can see from this map, were people from different sociological origins. So why is this? Why can this be important? Well, and now I'm talking precisely in the ways that the inventories help us to see this difference and diversity in this very small territory. Why can this be important? Well, this can be important first because it helps us to de-essentialize the idea of village elites in this territory in particular, but also this can be applied to the scholarship about the Portuguese Empire, where rural, urban, etc., somehow we attribute certain types of characteristics to this population, and many times diversity is much more present than we can expect. And this is the case, as could be, I didn't put that map, but these inventories also allow us to see the different devotions, or the main devotions in these different villages. We will then see again that there is no homogeneity in the 130 villages. Okay, this map, this kind of synchronic map that we can produce for many different things with the inventories of lands becomes a dynamic map when we start to use another set of information that we also refer to in chapter 2 of Catholic Orientalism, which is the collection called Livros das Comunidades. What is this collection constituted of? Well, it is constituted by the decisions made by the Gaunkas of each one of these villages. We don't have books for all the villages, I must say already this, but we have, like for some of the villages, 100 books. 100 books that go from the end of the 16th century until the 18th century. So you can see, in these books, you have the Nemos. Nemos is how they named the decisions taken in the Gaunkari. Sometimes each week we have the decisions for many of these villages during 2 centuries or 3 centuries at the level of the week. You can see the potential of this, about the what I call the political routines at the level of the village. Because if we do it not just with one case study, but in a kind of longitudinal microanalysis, then we really can have an image of the political dynamics happening at these villages in the context of the Portuguese imperial domination. Well, and so these livros das comunidades allow this, but there is another set of information that I'm not going to work here and just refer, which are the petitions sent either by members of these villages, either of this Gaunkari, but also by inhabitants of these villages directly to the Viceroy or even to the King of Portugal. One of interesting things, I would say, is because what is also referred in the nemos of the village, sometimes with criticism, more frequently with criticism, are the petitions sent by widows to the viceroy or to the Portuguese king. So these books also allow us to well, not to have a very deep information about women in Indian women and Goan women of this period, but also allow us to get into the lives of some of the women of the women of these villages. So this documentation is really extremely rich to study the bilaterality of relationship between empire and the village, surely, but also it's very rich because it allows us to study, let's see if I can say it in English, multilaterality of these relationships. And with this, I mean the relationships that are beyond the imperial life, because we are also very used to, mainly in Portuguese scholarship, to see the relationship with these territories very much as a top-down or bottom-up relationship, and not to see it in a relational way with the larger territories where these territories were inscribed, and their histories that was much longer than the history of the Portuguese Empire itself. So I'm not sure, Rozely, may you tell me, because I lost the time of my talk, how much time do I have?
More 5 minutes, please.
Oh, just 5 minutes. So I thought that I was better in time. Okay.
Only 10, maybe 10. You can.
Okay. Okay. So, Rozely, you can take this, perhaps. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So I would like just to refer some books of one of these villages, just for you to have an idea about the type of information we can get from it. And I'm talking about the village of Carambolim, which is a village very near the city of Goa, 10 kilometers apart, and which Gauntari was actually dominated not by Brahmins, but by Shardos, which from the Portuguese perspective were the second caste of Goa, but who were fighting to impose the idea that they were the first caste in the caste hierarchy. And this village also, the main deities of this village were not Brahmanical, but Dravidian. What again is another hint that helps us to discuss another shared idea that Goa was mainly a Brahmanical territory. So I'm just going to refer one book of 1612, and this book, the minutes of this book are written between 4th of February and 27th of November, and we have 63 minutes. So you can see the deep level of information we can have for the year of 1612. And this book has already interesting things to tell us. First, the first minutes are written in Konkan language and in the Modi characters, which is one of the graphies. Do you say that? Calligraphies? No, well, I don't know exactly the exact word in English, but that is very usual and common in Goa, and which is very difficult to read because it's not Devanagari, which is more common. So the first 3 minutes are in this language, but all the rest are already written in Portuguese and following an order which was saying that these books should be written in Portuguese. Just to tell one thing before, this practice of registering the nemos, the decisions, was a practice existing much before the presence of the Portuguese. But the fact is that the registers were made in palm leaves, and these palm leaves were destroyed much easily than the paper, and the Portuguese crown imposed to these villages to write the decisions in paper. So in paper and in Portuguese, and in paper coming from Portugal. So there is a clear intention of Lusitanize the administrative processes in the village. And so these minutes of 1612, they tell us more or less the different types of questions that one village had to deal with during a normal year. And one of these, and the main question actually, was regarding the distribution of land and the most fertile lands, and who was going to what's the word, to explore. It's explore, I expect, the land, that land. These are the main concern of each village. But then we have minutes about the relationship with the imperial power, the coming of officers, either to discuss the questions of tributes, or, for example, to discuss questions of internal defense, like asking the villages to put guards in the village to protect the village, and giving guns to these guards. And then we have decisions explaining who had been nominated to perform these duties. Another type of minutes, and which I'm very interested in, are the ones concerning the religious life in the village. And this is also important because before the arrival of the Portuguese, the Gauncas and the Gauncari are the place through which the relationship between temple and villages was going through. So they were the intermediaries for the religious life. And this function continued with and after Christianization. And in my view, and reading these minutes, they were really active agents in the construction of Christianity. And in that, like about things like the building of the churches, repairs of the churches, organization of processions like Corpus Christi, all this is discussed by the Gauncas of the village, and these meetings did not have a missionary or a priest being part of the meeting. So this is a point I also would like really to stress, which is sometimes we have too much missionary perspective on the processes of conversion, of Goa in particular. And this, to work with this kind of documentation allows us really to see how the locals were integrated or not in this project, in this process. So I'm not going to go on because I'm sure that I've talked more than I was supposed to. But just to conclude, I would like really to stress these ideas that on the one hand, this kind of exercise and to dig into the village life, to reconstruct as much as possible the micropolitics of the empire, is a way, on one hand, to discuss the way how the Portuguese Empire operated itself, but on the other way, is also a way of discussing, as we try to do in Catholic Orientalism, and to pursue that discussion about the concepts, and some of them social sciences still use, like the concept of case, for example. If you check a handbook on sociology, you will see the way our majority of sociologists, and I'm thinking about one in particular by Anthony Gibbons, use some of these concepts. They are still Orientalist concepts, and Portuguese sources produced during the Portuguese imperial experience from the 16th century onwards, precisely because they are early sources, they really allow us to see, to think of these processes in a much more dynamic way, and therefore questioning some of the common sense and some of the concepts that are shared still today, but by some social scientists. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ângela. I think that, yeah, we can see on the chat already, we have a few questions coming on. And so, if I may begin, then I think the first question would be by Professor Adma Muhanna from São Paulo University. And she's thanking for your presentations, and she was impressed by Nadal's idea of the door image, right? So I took note of it. Enter through their door, but be sure to leave through your door. And she's asking if what Ines thinks about this idea that rhetorical accommodation was one of the main reasons for Jesuit missionaries being substituted later on by other missionaries outside of the Padroado, maybe. I think we can hear you.
Yeah.
So the question is about Jesuit missionaries being abolished as the only order that was abolished. I think they were punished. This was part of the punishment, but not only because of accommodation. It was because of political reasons and things that were happening. Actually, in Brazil, they were marked out as troublemakers, taking too much consideration, having too much consideration for, well, injustice and downtrodden and this kind of missions where they were directly in conflict with Portuguese state and Spanish monarchy and Portuguese kingdom. So it was not just accommodation. Accommodation was actually, first of all, everybody accommodated. In Asia, there's nothing but accommodation. But then there are all these small kind of quarrels between various actors, not only because of accommodation, but because of rivalry, Franciscans against Jesuits, Jesuits against Capuchins, French Capuchins and Jesuits. They were at loggerheads. And then also political situation, Padroado versus French king. So accommodation was something that the Jesuits practiced kind of almost naturally, starting with Japan, actually starting with Valignano. That's where the idea was already there even before. I have shown that, but Valignano really made it into a theory. He theorized it, and then Matteo Ricci and Nobili actually made it into theological argument, adiaphora, and came up with a theological justification for doing what they were doing. So, and then there is a quarrel between on smaller things, or whether or not to have a tuft of hair if one is a Brahmin. But ultimately, it was not about that. It was about local rivalries. While accommodation was made everywhere, where it was a pragmatic strategy, and whoever, if there was nothing else to do, if there was no army, there was no state to back the missionary advances, then there was nothing else but accommodation, or just making converts by taking into Christianity whatever, as they would say, was not in direct, which was not direct contradiction with the Christian faith. So that is the adiaphora thing. Indifferent things could be appropriated into Christianity, and nobody was really against it, except sometimes some, a bishop would be against a certain kind of accommodation, and then he would be for some other accommodation. If you look at various bishops who supported some people, for example, Jesuits or Augustinians or somebody, and then they would not allow the same thing to Franciscans. It is very local phenomena, but we now study it as a kind of, this has become a kind of intellectual object, but it was actually really a grassroots strategy that Asia is like that. I mean, this is not Brazil, this is not America, this is not Africa, this is Asia, where, as Ângela has wonderfully pointed out, there are so many cultures. This is a very populated area. This is highly populated area. Everything belongs, I mean, there is a huge political and social microscopic life going on. And so coming with great ideas is good, great ideas of introducing a new religion, but it really depends on what the campo would say, how the local people would, what they would respond to you. I don't know if this is the right...
may I add just something to Ines'
Sure.
answer? Yes, I also agree completely that the question of the Jesuits is not about accommodation, even if accommodation can be a variable that they use also to criticize the Jesuits, but it's mainly political, because Jesuits, besides other things, they also wrote a lot of political treatises. And in these political treatises, they defended something, the right to resistance, namely the right to resist and to depose, if necessary, a tyrant king.
Yeah.
And this was really complicated to defend. First, because in the memory of all Europe of that period, there was the position of Charles I in England, which had been just cut off, no? And so this had been a real political trauma to the Portuguese and the Spanish and the French monarchies in this period, this kind of deep of situation. And there were also lots of, and that's also why Thomas Hobbes is writing on this period. There are lots of treatises trying to explain that revolt against tyrants was not a solution, was not possible, was not acceptable. And Jesuits were defending that. And they were fooling, as Ines was referring, and as you that work with Brazilian history know much better than myself, they were fooling many times the revolts in the aldeamentos, etc., against senhores do engenho, etc. And in India they were doing also that, but in Brazil in a very much more extensive way. So I would say that it's much more a political reason that is besides the what happened to the Jesuits in the together with the rivalries. Obviously, the other religious orders were seeing it an opportunity to taking over the hegemony that the Jesuits were getting during this period. So it was, as usual, a lot of variables, but I would say that the political one was the main variable in this case.
Okay, I'm going to use...
If I can...
yes.
No, sure. No, but I just wanted to say, especially missionaries who were not within any kind of political protection, under any kind of political protection by the Portuguese, for example, they were always taking the side of their converts. They were protecting their converts. They were never going against them. I mean, basically, they couldn't go against them. So that was what also rubbed the wrong way those people in Goa or in Madras or in Rome or in Portugal, because it looked like they had divided loyalties between the locality and what was expected of them to be in, from those who were given them. I mean, the authorities they belong to.
I think that's what happens when you have a fourth level of obedience, right? So you owe allegiance to a higher
the
authority.
Pope, yeah, to the Pope, yeah, you have.
But
we can talk about that.
Yeah,
yes.
I just want to use my prerogative here and make a follow-up question. So, okay, we know that accommodation is not everything, it's not the main reason here. We know that politics plays a very big role, economics too, because, for instance, in Brazil, right before the Jesuits were suppressed, they had lost their aldeamentos. They became all of a sudden full of money, right? Because they didn't have to support all those Indians. But the thing is that, so what makes Jesuit accommodation so special? Because we know that, for example, Valiano was theorizing about it. So what makes Jesuit accommodation special in comparison to others?
Comparison to whom? Give me examples, because the Capucins were sent by the French king.
Yeah.
And the Jesuits, and Jesuits in Madurai were sent by the Portuguese king. But there were also Jesuits sent by the French king. And they were all had to somehow fit into this settlement, Pondicherry, which is a French enclave, right? And they fight over a church, over a property in Pondicherry. That's how they got into the trouble. And also because they wanted, the Jesuits who were there before the Capucins were proposing a deal to divide who is going to take care of whom. So the Jesuits said, well, since we already have Madurai mission, we have this long tradition, we are going to take care of Indians, right? And the new Capuchins, you can take care of the settlers. There were kind of settlers. I mean, there was a Catholic population there. There were French, there were mestizos and all this stuff. And this is a concrete example. And the Capuchins were not happy with that. And they moved a lot of their people to Madras, not to Sao Tome, which is next door, but to Madras. They stayed in Madras under the British rule, and they hobnobbed with British officers. And this is where I said, and then they accommodated their churches to the British, to the British. So, for example, they decided to have churches really empty of too many sculptures, because the Protestant didn't like to have sculptures. So suddenly they were, and that was that. So that was one of the things. So this is why accommodation is every time it's something new, something different. I mean, I always, in the beginning, when you studied this phenomena 20 years ago, I was trying to find a kind of unifying system of, and then I thought that if I figure out the structure and how this is all put together, then I will understand each and every detail. This unified structure is just an ideological construct that the Jesuits constructed, actually, when they defended themselves. This is constructed through the dialogue with Rome, dialogue with theologians, and then there is I have written that in the first book and in the Annal article, how this accommodation functions. But it was only one example. Then I thought it was for everybody the same, but no, it is for accommodation is a very dispersed process. And today you can be accommodationist, tomorrow you can be just, wielding the power, even to the Jesuits. Go ahead, Ângela.
May I add again something? Yes, it was just related with what Ines just said, precisely because in Goa, the Jesuits were not accommodating so much because they had political and military power behind them. So they were not obliged to find these creative strategies to persuade the locals, because they had other ways, much more violent ways of persuading them. Saying, if you don't convert, you go to prison. I'm sorry. So this one thing. On the other, I also agree that everybody had to accommodate, but maybe there is, I don't know, because I don't know enough about other religious orders, and also because we have many, less detailed sources for the majority of the religious orders. So we can access the Jesuit strategies in a way that, well, we cannot concerning Franciscans for sure. And what difficult to make a comparison on that. But I would say, and about Franciscans, that's the religious order I know better, that their own spirituality and also examples of conversion were back to St. Francis of Assisi and to his going to the Sultan of Egypt, and also in these medieval times where, and they were many times presenting St. Francis as the model of conversion, which was not a model of accommodation. Was because their idea was, no, we have to present ourselves as we are, because the true apostles during Pentecostals, they had been able to talk every language because the Holy Spirit was allowing them to do it. So it's our example and the grace of God that will help to. That doesn't mean that they did not accommodate, but they had this kind of rhetorics to explain why they did not accommodate, or they did not know languages as the ones of Goa, because in Mexico they knew languages. But because, and then again, what Ines said, they are not all the same inside for the one religious orders. That very much depends on the concrete context they are in, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But you can, if you look at the Protestants who come in 1700s, Ziegenbalg and Plutchow and everything, and then all those after them. Interestingly, they are against accommodation, right? Of course, they are against accommodation, just like they resemble a little bit Franciscans, if you want. I mean, very pure, very... And then you see them accommodating on every level. And then even stealing and getting Jesuit books that the Jesuits they were harassing this poor Besky, because they realized that he had made such a, linguistically speaking, he has made inroads into paganism. And so they really wanted all his books, they published one of his grammars without his consent and all this stuff, because precisely they were getting into the same routine of accommodation as everybody else. But of course, in the beginning, they were saying, of course, not that there is only, God converts, not men. So, but ultimately, this is simple sociology. Everybody adapts.
Okay, I think Rozely has a question there.
Yeah, thank you, professors. Professor Célia Tavares of UERJ, Universidade of Rio de Janeiro, asked about the Catholic Orientalism can serve like a guide to analyze the process of missionaries in Asia. I want to add to these questions. If we can, it's possible to use the category to work with women or other minorities agents. We know that women is almost impossible to find women as producers of knowledge, but maybe they appropriating the circulated ideas and give them their own impress of it. So if you can see. Professor Celia said another question about the micropolitics analyze to Ângela. If it's possible, note the dynamic of the vocations, Rômulo. Yeah, to the formation of the local priests.
Yeah. Local clergy.
Clergy, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think Ines may go first.
You know, actually, Catholic Orientalism is a result of missionary actions. You know, Catholic Orientalism, when we speak about Catholic Orientalism, we think about knowledge produced by all these agents. And we, not only that they produce knowledge, but the importance of knowledge that these agents had of understanding the local is what makes them, is where this knowledge is Catholic Orientalism. So can it be a guide to, yes, I think it can be a guide to analyzing processes of missionization in Asia, but only guide in a sense that if you follow the money or you follow the Jesuits or you follow the missionaries, then you end up having learning a lot about local cultures. If that's what the idea is. So it's whether or not missionaries were at all successful, that's a completely different story. I mean, if that is implied in the question, missionaries may not be successful at all, or not successful at that moment when they were there. Maybe success came actually later for other reasons, like in South India. But when we were talking about Catholic Orientalism, it was really about what missionaries, and not just missionaries, come out with from their encounter with India and South Asia. They come out with this enormous amount of knowledge, which is going to, as Ângela also said, maybe now or maybe some other time you said, is going to help them also think about themselves back in Europe. You know, they are creating a kind of a huge source of knowledge, which is also a knowledge about the self, about the Catholics themselves, by seeing, by being confronted with these descriptions of paganism, which today we will call Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam. They actually saw themselves and who they are. This is feeding, so this Catholic Orientalism for us is important, and we called it that way because we wanted to show that it was going straight into enlightenment reflection of Europe itself. Europe is thinking itself, various Europeans, they're not all the same, but they're thinking about themselves better, maybe, or maybe not, through those documents and archives of these other people who were not there before in their history and in their horizon. So a lot of things are actually coming out, are going to be decisive for the construction of Europe, are Catholic, coming from this Catholic Orientalism. So, yeah, I don't know if that is it's maybe not, Celia, maybe that's not exactly what you wanted to hear.
May I add again something to Ines? Yes, well, I agree completely with Ines, but I wanted to go back to one of the to the subtitle of the book, Indian Knowledge, and when we decided to put Indian knowledge, we were discussing what do we mean by Indian knowledge, and by Indian knowledge we meant knowledge about India, yes, for sure, but also knowledge from Indians, coming from Indians. And I think that there is a methodological intention in Catholic Orientalism that can serve as a guide, as Celia would put it, for telling other stories of missionaries, which is this idea of recovering polyphonic history, and by reading against the grain sources, many of them that are familiar to us for a long time, but they had not been read in that way. I think Ines, no? Can I?
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, you're right. I mean, missionary knowledge is really important. But of course, we were reading hagiographies and histories and all these concocted knowledge that the missionaries were producing. And that is Catholic Orientalism. And this Catholic Orientalism then used back in the field, because some Jesuits were coming back, or Franciscans, and expecting certain things to happen in a particular way because they have already read the life of Xavier by João de Lucena. So when they were coming back to India, they were coming to India as recruited young people. They had expectations. It's a whole, or they were going to Brazil with certain expectations they got from reading histories of India, and this we can see in Indipete, in those letters, requests to be sent to the mission, where they would say, well, I can go to Paraguay or I can go to Madurai. They were looking at their favorite missionary reports and then dreaming of missions where they would go. So this, that enough, maybe.
There was this question of Celia about the native clergy, isn't it? Celia, actually only now I'm starting to do a systematic reading of these minutes of these villages. So I cannot tell you, really, I cannot by now, that these dynamics of leading people to become clergy, clerics, in the context of the Portuguese Empire, is internal to the village. I'm sure there is this internal dynamics, because we know that the native clergy of originary from Goa, most of them was coming from these villages and not from the capital of Goa. But until now, I didn't see that present in the minutes of the books I've already read. Even if that is quite clear, the religious question is very present, and in some of these books, there are already complaints against the clergy of Portuguese origin or other European origin, saying they are not performing their duties, and that it would be better to have a local cleric. So it's not something directly about the vocation, but there is already in some of these minutes an idea that the local clergy would be better. But in other villages, on the other way, there are critics to the local cleric that is there and asking from one of Portugal because he would be more Christian, better Christian than the local one. So it's also interesting to see there is not necessarily a defense of the Portuguese against the locals or the locals against the Portuguese. That again could depend on from village to village. What is also quite interesting.
Can I say something also? But Ângela, here I am not on my terrain; it's your terrain. This is a question also for you. It's just that a lot of things are decided in India on the local basis, and this local basis is really in the clause of caste. Okay, so some people could become clergy, priests, and if I remember correctly, it is really the caste question of who can become a priest or not. At least the caste question is of who can become a regular priest or not. So, for example, in Goa, you had Brahmins, like this José Vaz. He was a Brahmin Goan Catholic, okay? And he actually instituted a new order, Brahmin Goan Oratorians. They were only Brahmins in this order. And then later they were also in Theatines, right? But Sharodosh went to another order. I'm not sure which one. Sharodosh could not mix. The priests who were of Brahmin caste could not mix in the same order with people from other castes. Ângela, you know that much better. So
No, definitely this is a process that is quite clear going on from the second half of 17th century onwards. Before that, there is lots of suspicion towards Indians, the idea of Indians becoming clerics. There are some cases that they do, but they stop also doing it. Like there is the famous case of this Jesuit that is in the mid-16th century that is part of
Pedro Brahman.
But Pedro Brahman.
Luis Pedro Brahman.
But then later, the Jesuits don't like anymore to have these people among them, no? Yeah. So there is, and the question of caste definitely is a question that is crucial also because the Brahmins of Goa have this ability to trying to show that since they were the priestly caste before the Portuguese arrived, they were naturally the ones that had the abilities of being the Christian priests. So it's there is also all this discursive rhetoric from the Brahmins trying to, well, they will say that they were also the nobles, but they wanted all the power positions, so they used their rhetorics in order to.
But to follow Celia's question, could any caste, a boy from any caste, through the schooling, proper schooling, become just a secular priest? I don't.
In theory, yes.
Yeah.
In theory, yes.
Okay.
But then we have these situations that were very much criticized by an Italian theatine, Antonio Asbisoni Spinola, that were local clergy that did not go to humble places to provide the sacraments, precisely because of questions of caste, like a Brahmin priest would not
go anywhere.
Only to Brahmin houses, but not to other houses, because touching or sharing things with other caste members was violating its Brahmin identity. So there were lots of problems concerning the native.
But then you have Mateus de Castro, and then you have José Vaz, and they actually become missionaries and address the schooling and can be anybody. They can make themselves into anybody. Outside of Goa, they could touch untouchables.
And Castro had to go to Rome in order to be ordained priest, because in Goa they didn't allow him. So yeah, it's.
Thank you. We have many questions here. I'm will.
Okay, we speak less. Sorry, we are all talking.
I think that
okay.
what we can do is that we can forward you like the questions later if people want to still get an answer from you, so they can email us the questions that weren't answered here. I just wanted to maybe in these last 10 minutes to go to a question that I think is particularly significant for a Brazilian audience, which consists of the main group watching us right now are Brazilians. So I remember that a few months ago I saw Ângela in a very nice panel commenting on the history of race in the Americas. And then I remember that Ângela commented something that we have to consider the whole history of caste and the research on caste and knowledge produced regarding caste in India to think the concept of race in the Americas. So I wanted to know if you have any other ideas of how can we crisscross these two productions, because there's still a very wide disparity between what is produced towards Portuguese America, historiography on Portuguese America, and historiography on Portuguese Asia. So what other connections can we see there, particularly regarding these historiographical questions here?
Ines, do you want to?
Do you want to say? You were throwing in a hot potato, so.
Because I think that Catholic Orientalism is such a nice way to try to bind all these knowledge together so we can actually use it as a corpus and try to introduce it into the greater narrative of modernity, because it's something that is it's appropriated by these Northern Europeans. Maffei includes a lot of information from these corpus in his history, and then it spreads all over Europe. But then in the end, it's kind of lost, right? So we don't. They are not citing these people. They are not referring to these people. But we know that this knowledge influenced a lot of the way that Europe thinks about the rest of the world, particularly considering that this is a corpus of knowledge that it starts to be produced in the early 16th century. So it predates all the other colonial enterprises, right? Or maybe all of them. Let's not put all, because or else the Spanish are going to be angry with us. They're trying to recover Spanish history some way. But I wanted to know what other categories you see that could contribute to a better understanding of the history of Brazil, maybe, or the Spanish Americas, considering these knowledge produced in Asia, because caste is just one category, but we have many others, right? So do you see any other possible connections there?
But in any case, caste is a very, very ugly business. And we were taught at one point after, when I was a graduate student, that there was this post-colonial movement going on in academia. Very nice guys there. Dipesh Chakraborty and all these people. And there was somehow this idea that castes were all, and Bernard Cohn, that castes were all invented by the British when they started taking censuses, and everybody was, and then they classified it, and that there was much less, we were taught that caste is local, and so it is only British who made it into hierarchical kind of category, but that locally you can have, Brahmin is not on the top. It is only in Brahmin ideology that he is on top, really. That is all, we can agree with that. But even today, I live in India, caste is the most structuring, and you don't know it until you feel it or you hear stories. For example, today in India, if you are in prison, you will be classified, you will be put in prison according to your caste. Okay? So you can be highfalutin, a gangster of a fantastic, gangster who killed a lot of people, who is a urban Mumbai gangster. They love them in the movies these days. Okay, and if you go to prison, unless you have a lot of money and you can get over your caste distinction, you will be put to clean toilets, because that is what. And if you are of Dalit, untouchable, former untouchable status, caste, you will be put to clean the toilets, because Dalits clean the toilets. So it is. I mean, it is a really deadly structure that is still present in India. And when the Portuguese arrived, they of course found it. And one of the biggest arguments against accommodation was that the Jesuits, with their accommodationist strategies that they were defending, acquiesced. I mean, they actually accepted caste. They themselves put people in different categories so as not to mix them, because they could not be mixed. So, that is that is one of the things that that I can contribute like this very, very quickly, is that caste is important. Now, how it ended up being connected to race and color of the skin and all this stuff, then, we read Avalignano, we read all those Jesuits who started talking about white people, and brancos and negros, and those who are white are more intelligent, and those who are black are less intelligent. I mean, their anthropology then.
I would remind, in the 50s and 60s, there was actually a theoretical debate about race and caste in the Indian scholarship, and whether we were talking about the same things or different things. At that time, the answer was more saying these are two different things, caste and race. And also there was this idea that caste was essentially Asian and race was essentially Atlantic and directly connected with slave trade. And that race had emerged as a condition that associated African people and the black collar, and that was the origins of race, and caste was not race, was something different. Today there are other questionings and other debates going on.
Absolutely. For example,
that also question this division. And I'm not part of the debates in the international terms, but I'm part of those that think that this is not so productive. Because first, I do believe that we should de-Atlantize, if I can say this word, the debate on race. I think the debate on race is not only a Western debate, it should really expand to think about other forms of racism in Asiatic societies. And in my view, caste is actually one of the most dramatic forms of racism, and which is not connected with African slavery. And I would say that the discussion on racism would be richer if we were able to think it more globally. I don't like the word global, but I'm using it to be more precise. Well,
I was a student of Jerry Berriman. He was an anthropologist who worked on India, died some time ago, and he had this theory, which everybody, all the historians of India didn't like that racism and casteism is the same thing. And that but the results are the same. And so he was talking about race in America and caste in India as something comparable, completely comparable. Okay, with certain differences, but these were details. According to him, it was really, the power structure that caste and the race in a given society is producing, it was the same thing. So, and today Dalit scholars are pointing to the same, to exactly the same issue. Is being Dalit in India is being a black, black in the 19th century America. It's almost not having any rights today.
I even would say this, that maybe it's an heresy, but I still I like to be an Orthodox. I would say that in the context of the Portuguese Empire, we have like 3 languages going on in the 16th, from the 15th century onwards. One is the language of discrimination of New Christians, the people of Jew origin, and which leads to what we know, the process of purity of blood and all the implementation of these statutes of purity of blood. The second is obviously related with the increasing presence of Africans in the context of Portugal, metropolitan Portugal, and the Portuguese overseas territories. So these daily interactions with people of a very different color, the Africans. And the third is the caste language, which actually, as we know, it's a word that the Portuguese brought up to India to label a system that existed, and in the beginning of the 16th century, they already start to refer to it in a very, define it as something based on blood and transmission and lineage. So I would say that in the context of the Portuguese Empire, we know that the word caste and travels, there is a mobility. It's used in Mexican territories, for example, the famous casta painting with not exactly the same meaning, but the word travels. But I would say that during the early modern period, in the context of the Portuguese Empire, these 3 languages somehow converge or feed each other, and the 3 of them construct the idea of racism, the one that we more or less share today.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. The others questions that, Rômulo, you want to say something?
No, we have a lot of other questions here on our chat, so I think that we'll be forwarding them to you by email later on.
By email.
If people want us to forward them, of course.
Yeah, sure.
And I will be also forwarding some of the questions that I took note, because Rozely and we did our homework and we read the book and we took lots of notes and we have lots of questions each one. So we'll be forwarding them. We'll be disturbing you a little bit more.
Yeah, we can send you an email with these questions, and then we put in the chat in YouTube the answers to the people can see the answers. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so sorry because we spoke too much.
No, it was wonderful. Don't worry.
Perfect.
Well, thank you very much also for letting me reread my book. I had to reread it. I had forgotten so much, and I just thought, Ângela, this was really not bad. not a bad book when you reread it as a just any reader. I have forgotten so much from it.
Yeah, we can wait for the Portuguese.
Yeah, no, it's
version.
going on. I was telling Ines that it is going on. It should have been done before, but it's my fault that it didn't happen yet.
Good, that would be great. That would be great.
Yeah.
All right. So on that note, I think that we'll end our transmission here. I want to thank you too for participating. I want to thank Rozely. I want to thank the staff that is going through a lot behind the scenes here to keep us online. And thank you all for watching us, and see you next. And I think that Rozely has the poster or for next session, maybe.
Yeah, I have just 1 minute because I didn't.
Yeah, because we have to free Ângela in this because we are all starving here.
Yeah, and I'm going to a party. I'm going to a party now.
Yes.
Let me. I. You can see.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Next month, we will receive Jorge Leão. He is postgraduate. He is in the postgraduate in UF, Universidade Federal Fluminense, and this is the speech that he will give to us. A doutrinação cristã no Japão, uma visão das missões jesuítas através dos catequistas japoneses. It will be in November 26, and it will be in the night here in Brazil. So, yeah. So I hope that you can see our next forum. I have to thank you so much for Professor Ines and Professor Ângela to accept our invite. It was a great moment, and I hope that we can speak more into the email and answer the questions.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us.
So,
Thank you
Rômulo?
all. Yes.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.